In 1942, when veterans of the Wehrmacht arrived in North Africa from the Eastern Front, they believed they had already seen the worst modern war could offer. They had endured the vast artillery barrages of the Soviet Union, where entire horizons flashed red before an assault. Compared to that, the Americans seemed inexperienced, almost amateur. In Tunisia, German officers quickly formed opinions about U.S. fire support. Captured reports and divisional summaries described American artillery as slow to register targets, hesitant to mass guns, and overly dependent on visible adjustments. Shells landed wide, barrages arrived late. German units learned they could often reposition between salvos. To veterans hardened at places like Rzhev and Kharkov, this new enemy appeared clumsy. The standard American divisional gun at the time, the M2A1 105mm howitzer, was reliable and mechanically sound. It could fire a 33-pound high-explosive shell over 7 miles. But reliability is not the same as lethality. In early engagements, German observers noted that American batteries rarely achieved the sudden shock effect that defined Soviet or even German preparatory fires. Instead, rounds would arrive, adjustments would follow, and only then would concentration increase. That pattern meant warning, and warning meant survival. German artillery doctrine emphasized flexibility at the regimental level, but it also relied heavily on pre-registered targets and forward observers with field telephones. American forces, still adapting to desert warfare, struggled with communications and coordination across dispersed formations. In the open expanses of Tunisia, visibility worked both ways. Observers could see impacts clearly, but so could the defenders. After-action reports from early 1943 described German units remaining in position under American shelling longer than they would have under Soviet fire. The psychological threshold was different. Soviet artillery often signaled an imminent infantry assault. American bombardments, at least initially, did not always follow that pattern. For experienced German non-commissioned officers, that distinction mattered. There was also cultural arrogance at play. Many Wehrmacht veterans viewed the U.S. Army as industrial but inexperienced. They respected British artillery traditions, but Americans were seen as newcomers. The assumption was simple: material without mastery, guns without doctrine. Yet beneath these early misjudgments, something was developing. American artillery doctrine differed fundamentally from German practice. Instead of concentrating authority at the battery or battalion level alone, U.S. forces were refining a centralized control system that allowed multiple battalions to mass fire rapidly. The Fire Direction Center concept, still evolving in 1942, aimed to compute firing data scientifically and distribute it efficiently. In Tunisia, the system was not yet perfected, but its foundation was there. German intelligence did not immediately recognize this shift. Reports focused on observable shortcomings, slow response times, visible ranging shots, inconsistent concentration. What they could not see was the learning curve. American units rotated, retrained, and standardized procedures at remarkable speed. Logistics networks improved. Radio coordination became more reliable. Mathematical firing tables were refined. Even in Tunisia, there were moments that hinted at change. Some German accounts describe isolated instances of unusually accurate counter-battery fire. A few mention sudden concentrations that seemed disproportionate to the visible number of guns. These incidents were often dismissed as anomalies or attributed to British support. But war is an unforgiving teacher. The U.S. Army absorbed lessons from every failed fire mission. Officers analyzed dispersion patterns, they studied communication delays,
They streamlined the chain between observer and gun crew. Unlike armies strained to the breaking point, American forces in 1942 possessed something rare: time to improve and the industrial base to support experimentation. For the German soldiers crouched in slit trenches near Kasserine or along the Mareth line, the immediate reality still reinforced their assumptions. Shells whistled in, but not all at once. Impacts walked toward their positions rather than erupting simultaneously. There was fear, but not paralysis. And so the narrative hardened. American artillery was loud, but manageable; dangerous, but predictable; irritating, rather than decisive. What the veterans could not yet know was that predictability was already being engineered out of the system. The very characteristics they mocked, methodical calculation, centralized control, reliance on mathematics, were the ingredients of something they had not yet encountered. In 1942 and early 1943, the German soldier in Tunisia still believed the sky behaved according to familiar rules. You heard the ranging rounds, you counted the seconds, you moved between impacts. Survival was a matter of experience and timing.
But somewhere behind the American lines, officers with slide rules and firing charts were solving a different problem. Not how to fire louder, not how to fire longer, but how to make the first salvo the last warning anyone would ever receive. The contempt felt in Tunisia was real. It was recorded in reports, in letters, in the casual confidence of veterans who believed they understood artillery in all its forms. Yet that confidence rested on observation of a system still under construction. By the time those same soldiers would face American guns again in Europe, the pattern they relied upon, the comforting sequence of adjustment, correction, and gradual concentration, would begin to disappear. In Tunisia, the shells fell wide and late. For the moment, that was enough to preserve belief. But belief, like doctrine, can be shattered.
By late 1943, something fundamental was changing inside the American artillery arm, though few German intelligence officers fully grasped it at the time. The guns themselves had not dramatically transformed. The M2A1 105mm howitzer was still the backbone of U.S. infantry divisions. The heavy M1 155mm long tom was already in service, capable of reaching targets more than 14 miles away. What changed was not the hardware, it was the system behind it. The U.S. Army refined what it called the Fire Direction Center, a centralized command post within each battalion, where firing data was calculated, corrected, and distributed. Instead of each battery operating semi-independently, American doctrine increasingly emphasized coordination. Observers transmitted target information by radio. Data flowed into the Fire Direction Center. Charts, firing tables, and slide rules turned coordinates into precise gun settings. Within minutes, multiple batteries could act as one. German doctrine valued flexibility and initiative, but American artillery pursued mathematical synchronization. Every gun crew drilled the same procedures. Every observer learned standardized reporting formats. The emphasis was not on improvisation, but on repeatable precision. Errors were studied, response times were measured, communications were streamlined. In Sicily and Italy, German units began noticing subtle differences. Counter-battery fire improved. When German guns revealed their position, retaliation sometimes came faster than expected. Reports described instances where American shells landed with unsettling accuracy against newly established positions. Still, these were seen as localized improvements rather than evidence of systemic change. The real innovation lay in timing. American artillery planners experimented with a method that required meticulous calculation. Instead of firing ranging shots and adjusting gradually, they computed firing solutions so precisely that the first rounds could land on target without prior warning. More than that, They calculated flight times from different batteries positioned miles apart. Guns at varying distances would fire at staggered moments so their shells would arrive simultaneously. The concept became known as time on target. To execute such a mission required confidence in mathematics, discipline in training, and absolute synchronization of clocks. Every battery had to trust the data. Every gun crew had to fire at the exact second assigned. If done correctly, the target area would experience the sudden impact of dozens, sometimes hundreds of shells within a few heartbeats. For the soldiers on the receiving end, the difference was profound. Traditional artillery provided cues, a ranging round, then correction, then escalation. Time on target erased that sequence. There was no gradual buildup, no auditory warning of adjustment, only sudden, overwhelming concussion. German intelligence summaries from Italy began referencing unusually concentrated American fire. Some officers speculated about hidden masked batteries. Others suspected British coordination. Few immediately attributed the phenomenon to a doctrinal shift that allowed dispersed units to function as a single firing instrument. At the same time, American logistical capacity ensured ammunition supply rarely became the limiting factor. Shell production in the United States dwarfed that of Germany by 1944. This industrial foundation allowed artillery commanders to think in terms of mass and repetition. If a target required saturation, it could be saturated. Training exercises emphasized speed. Observers practiced transmitting concise fire missions. Fire direction centers drilled calculations under pressure. The goal was to reduce the interval between request and impact. In some cases, battalions achieved response times measured in minutes. German prisoners of war later recalled their surprise at how quickly American fire could adjust. Positions that had not fired for days suddenly drew precise counter-battery strikes after a single salvo. Movement in daylight became increasingly risky. Roads within range of American guns felt exposed. Still, skepticism persisted among veteran formations. The Eastern Front had conditioned them to equate mass with visible preparation. They expected artillery to announce itself. What they began encountering instead was coordination without spectacle. Guns hidden beyond hills and hedgerows could participate in missions miles away, their involvement invisible until impact. By early 1944, American divisions in Britain were rehearsing large-scale fire plans in preparation for operations on the continent. Synchronization drills refined time-on-target procedures. Fire direction centers expanded their capability to integrate battalions at the corps level. The scale of potential concentration increased dramatically. What had once been an artillery arm learning under desert conditions was becoming a networked system. Each gun was a component, each observer a sensor, each fire direction center a calculating engine. The battlefield, increasingly, was a grid defined by coordinates rather than line of sight. For German analysts focused on tanks and aircraft production, artillery improvements did not always command priority attention. Yet among frontline units that encountered these evolving methods, a shift in tone is detectable. Reports grew less dismissive. Descriptions of American fire used words like sudden and heavy with greater frequency. The transformation was not loud. It did not announce itself with a new weapon unveiled in propaganda. It unfolded through training schedules, standardized procedures, and relentless rehearsal. By mid-1944, the underlying structure was ready. The guns had not changed dramatically, but the way they would be used had. And when German soldiers next faced American artillery on a large scale, the Warnell shots they once relied upon would begin to disappear.
In June 1944, as Allied forces launched Operation Overlord, many German units along the French coast expected the main threat to come from the sea and the air. Naval guns, strategic bombing, airborne landings. Artillery, in their experience, was something that built gradually, registered, adjusted, and then intensified. What they began encountering in Normandy was different. Once American forces established themselves inland,
their artillery moved forward with deliberate speed. The bocage countryside, dense hedgerows, sunken lanes, and small fields limited visibility and restricted armored maneuver. For both sides, it was a claustrophobic battlefield, but for American artillery planners, it was a grid of coordinates waiting to be calculated. Forward observers accompanied infantry units, climbing into church towers, crawling along hedgerows, and establishing radio contact the moment resistance was identified. A machine gun nest, a crossroads, a suspected assembly area behind a ridge. Coordinates were transmitted quickly and in standardized format. Within the fire direction centers, calculations were performed with rehearsed efficiency. Then came the silence. German veterans later described a pattern that unsettled them. There were no ranging shots, no gradual tightening of impact. Instead, entire target areas erupted at once. Shells from multiple battalions arrived within seconds of each other. Earth and metal burst upward in overlapping detonations. The first indication of a fire mission was the concussion itself. Time on target had arrived in Western Europe. In the weeks following the landings, American divisions used synchronized fire to neutralize counterattacks before they fully formed. German units attempting to regroup behind the front found assembly areas struck without warning. Staff cars, ammunition wagons, even field kitchens became targets once identified. The sense of depth, of safety behind the immediate line began to erode. Diaries recovered after the fighting reflect this psychological shift. Soldiers wrote of artillery that seemed to appear from nowhere, of positions shattered before orders to disperse could be completed. Some described the impossibility of predicting when the next concentration would fall. The old method of counting seconds between firing flash and impact no longer applied. Often, there was no visible flash to see. American artillery doctrine also emphasized rapid counter-battery response. Radar and sound-ranging units helped identify German gun positions. Once located, those coordinates could be fed into corps-level fire plans. Multiple battalions, miles apart, would engage the same target in synchronized missions. For German artillery crews, firing even a brief salvo risked immediate retaliation. During the breakout from Normandy in July 1944, artillery became the decisive enabler. As American forces pushed south in Operation Cobra, massive concentrations preceded infantry advances. While strategic bombing played a controversial role, divisional and corps artillery delivered continuous support, isolating strongpoints and cutting off reinforcement routes. German accounts from this period reveal mounting frustration. Counterattacks stalled under concentrated fire. Movement by daylight grew increasingly hazardous. Even at night, pre-registered American defensive fires could be triggered within minutes of detected movement. Road junctions and suspected assembly areas were often already plotted on firing charts. What distinguished this artillery from earlier campaigns was not merely volume, it was coordination. Batteries that never saw each other could function as a single instrument. Guns positioned miles apart contributed to the same time-on-target mission. The effect on the receiving end was indistinguishable from being surrounded by invisible cannons. Medical officers began noting increased cases of what they termed nervous exhaustion. Soldiers reported heightened anxiety during quiet periods, anticipating sudden bombardment. Sleep became fragmented. The unpredictability was corrosive. The absence of warning removed the illusion of control. German commanders recognized the tactical implications. Traditional defensive doctrine relied on absorbing preparatory fire and then responding once infantry advanced. But synchronized American missions often struck command posts and communication nodes directly. Telephone lines were severed, runners were killed en route, orders were delayed not merely by confusion, but by concussive shock. Perhaps most unsettling was the realization that American artillery did not always signal an immediate assault. Sometimes it was used purely to disrupt, to disorganize, to exhaust. Shelling might erupt at dawn, then cease, only to resume hours later against a different coordinate. The pattern was governed by calculation rather than emotion. By late summer, surviving veterans who had once dismissed American gunners began adjusting their language. Reports grew more cautious. The word precise appeared more frequently. So did overwhelming. There was growing acknowledgement that the enemy had mastered not just industrial production, but operational integration. In Normandy, the hedgerows concealed many things: ambushes, anti-tank guns, defensive strongpoints, but they could not conceal a position from plotted coordinates once observed. The battlefield had become less about what you could see and more about what the enemy could calculate. For the German soldier crouched in a slit trench outside Saint-Lô or near Mortain, the sky no longer behaved predictably. There was no rising crescendo to brace against, only sudden detonation, only the violent simultaneity of impact. The transformation that began in Tunisia, invisible and underestimated, had matured. Contempt had given way to something else, not yet panic, not yet collapse, but a growing awareness that artillery no longer followed familiar rules. In Normandy, the sky did not warn. It struck. By the autumn of 1944, the war had moved to the dense, dark woodlands along the German-Belgian border. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest unfolded in terrain that seemed almost designed to magnify fear. Thick pine trees blocked visibility. Ravines channeled movement. Mud swallowed vehicles. For the German soldier, it was familiar ground. Defensive positions were dug deep. Fields of fire were narrow but carefully planned. What they could not fully control was the sky above the trees. American artillery units had followed the front relentlessly. Guns were dragged forward through mud and rain. Ammunition columns navigated shattered roads under constant threat. Despite miserable conditions, the fire direction centers continued functioning with mechanical precision. Coordinates were plotted. Targets were registered. Defensive fire plans were prepared in layers. In open terrain, artillery blasts threw earth outward. In a forest, the effect changed completely. When high explosive shells detonated in the treetops, the bursts produced lethal showers of splintered wood and metal fragments. German soldiers called it Baumkrepiere, tree bursts. Instead of fragments striking primarily at ground level, they rained downward. Trenches offered less protection. Foxholes became traps. Even well-dug positions failed to shield against shrapnel descending from above. Diaries from the Hürtgen described a different kind of terror than Normandy. There, the shock had come from simultaneity. Here, it came from enclosure. The forest trapped sound. Concussions echoed between trunks. Smoke and debris lingered under the canopy. Visibility after a barrage dropped to almost nothing. American artillery units increasingly relied on pre-registered defensive fires. Every likely German approach route was plotted in advance. If movement was detected by patrol, by sound, by flare, observers could call in concentrations within minutes. Time-on-target missions were still used, but even standard fire missions achieved devastating results in the confined terrain. German medical officers began documenting a rise in combat fatigue cases. Soldiers who showed no visible wounds reported trembling, disorientation, and inability to respond to orders. The constant anticipation of shelling wore down even experienced veterans. The forest offered concealment from aircraft, but it amplified artillery. One regimental report noted that units subjected to prolonged American bombardment required extended rest periods before being considered combat effective again. Another described entire platoons becoming unresponsive after repeated tree-burst concentrations. The physical damage was measurable. The psychological damage was harder to quantify, but increasingly evident. Artillery was no longer merely preparation for an infantry assault. It became the dominant force shaping the battle. American commanders often used sustained bombardment to isolate strong points before committing ground troops. In some sectors, advances were measured not in sweeping maneuvers, but in yards gained under covering fire. For German defenders, counter-battery response grew more difficult. Dense forest limited observation. American guns positioned miles away remained hidden beyond ridgelines. Firing positions shifted when necessary. The industrial advantage behind those guns ensured that ammunition expenditure remained high despite weather and terrain. There are accounts from Hürtgen of soldiers describing the sensation that the forest itself had turned hostile. Trees, once protective, became hazards. The cracking sound of splintering trunks preceded impact. Even during lulls, the memory of downward falling fragments lingered. Helmets were checked repeatedly for dents. Men avoided standing near large trees, uncertain whether proximity increased or decreased risk. Communication lines were frequently severed by shell fire. Runners navigating narrow trails risked sudden barrages triggered by observed movement. Command posts relocated repeatedly, yet many were still struck once identified. The perception grew that no depth was truly safe. By November, the cumulative strain showed clearly. Replacement troops arrived with minimal experience. Veterans, already exhausted from years of war, faced bombardments unlike those they had endured in Russia or North Africa. There, artillery had been vast and terrifying. Here, it was intimate and inescapable. American artillery units refined coordination further, integrating heavier calibers when necessary. A target designated by a forward observer might draw fire from multiple battalions within range. The effect in forested terrain was devastating. Explosions overlapped, shredding branches, collapsing dugouts, and turning narrow clearings into killing zones. German commanders still fought stubbornly. Defensive doctrine emphasized holding ground, but reports increasingly referenced artillery superiority as a determining factor. Counterattacks launched after bombardment often faltered before reaching their objective. Survivors emerged shaken, disoriented, sometimes unable to recall the sequence of events. The Hürtgen Forest did not produce dramatic breakthroughs. It produced attrition, slow, grinding, relentless, and throughout it, artillery remained the constant presence. Rain fell, temperatures dropped, infantry rotated in and out of shattered positions, but the guns continued. For the German soldier huddled beneath the trees, the fear was no longer just of death, it was of inevitability, of shells that might arrive without warning, of fragments descending from above when the next coordinate was calculated. In Tunisia, American artillery had been mocked. In Normandy, it had inspired dread. In the Hürtgen Forest, it began to break endurance itself.
In December 1944, as German forces launched their final major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge, many commanders believed surprise would compensate for material inferiority. The attack through the Ardennes aimed to split Allied lines, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. Speed, shock, and concentrated armor were meant to overwhelm American positions before reserves could react. In the opening hours, surprise did achieve local success. Fog grounded Allied aircraft. Forward American units were overrun or forced back.
German columns pushed through narrow roads bordered by forest. For a brief moment, initiative returned. But artillery does not require clear skies. Even as infantry lines bent, American artillery units established defensive fire plans with remarkable speed. Batteries repositioned under pressure. Fire direction centers recalculated targets as the front shifted. Roads, bridges, crossroads, every key terrain feature within range was plotted. German officers quickly realized that advancing through the Ardennes meant advancing along predictable routes. The terrain that offered concealment also restricted maneuver. Armored columns funneled into narrow valleys and road junctions. Once identified, these choke points became artillery magnets. American doctrine emphasized massing fires rapidly at decisive points. Corps-level coordination allowed multiple battalions to concentrate on emerging threats. A German spearhead detected near a crossroads might suddenly face shells from guns positioned miles apart. Time-on-target missions ensured that the first warning was simultaneous impact. Survivor accounts describe armored vehicles halted not only by destroyed bridges or mechanical failure, but by sudden, concentrated shelling that shattered formations. Trucks carrying fuel and ammunition burned under repeated strikes. Attempts to bypass blocked roads often led into pre-registered defensive fires. In Bastogne, surrounded American forces relied heavily on artillery to blunt repeated German assaults. Despite encirclement, communication between observers and batteries remained functional. Fire missions were adjusted under pressure. German infantry advancing through snow-covered fields encountered sudden concentrations that disrupted coordination and momentum. What made American artillery particularly formidable during the Bulge was responsiveness. Even under chaotic conditions, calls for fire were processed quickly. Units that had trained relentlessly in synchronization executed missions with minimal delay. German commanders noted that American artillery seemed able to shift focus within minutes, reinforcing threatened sectors with calculated precision. There was also the matter of ammunition. While German units struggled with fuel shortages and strained supply lines, American artillery continued firing at high rates. Industrial capacity ensured steady replenishment. The knowledge that the enemy could sustain such firepower added to the psychological burden. German after-action reports from January 1945 increasingly acknowledged artillery as the primary obstacle to offensive success. Tank losses were significant, but delays caused by shelling often proved more decisive than direct anti-tank engagements. Roads cratered by bombardment slowed reinforcement. Assembly areas identified by reconnaissance drew immediate fire. Veterans who had once dismissed American gunners now spoke in different terms. The language shifted from critique to reluctant respect. Words like Überlegen, superior, appeared in assessments, not because of individual gun performance, but because of integration. The system functioned even under stress. For soldiers on the ground, the experience was cumulative. Years of war had conditioned them to endure hardship, but during the Bulge, the sense of facing an inexhaustible artillery network became difficult to ignore. The sky did not merely threaten, it enforced limits. Every attempted maneuver risked calculated retaliation. Medical officers once again recorded rising cases of exhaustion and shock. The cold and constant movement compounded strain, but artillery remained the ever-present force. Even during temporary advances, German troops could not assume safety. Defensive lines hastily established in captured villages were often shelled before fortification was complete. As Allied air power returned with clearing weather, the situation worsened. Yet even before aircraft dominated the skies again, artillery had already shaped the battlefield. It isolated spearheads, disrupted supply, and protected defensive hubs. By early 1945, the offensive had stalled. German units withdrew, depleted, and fragmented. In post-war memoirs, several commanders acknowledged that American artillery superiority, its speed, coordination, and sustained volume, had become one of the greatest tactical challenges in the West. The transformation was complete. In Tunisia, American artillery seemed inexperienced. In Sicily and Italy, it hinted at growing coordination. In Normandy, it struck without warning. In the Hürtgen Forest, it eroded endurance. In the Ardennes, it imposed inevitability. For the German soldier standing in a snow-covered trench in January 1945, the realization was stark. The enemy's strength was not merely in numbers or machines, but in a system that turned mathematics into shock, industry into pressure, and coordination into dominance. There was no dramatic moment when belief shattered, no single barrage that changed everything. Instead, it was the accumulation of impacts, the understanding that any movement might be plotted, any concentration detected, any road registered on a firing chart. The sky had not literally turned against them, but it no longer behaved according to familiar rules. And by the time the guns fell silent in Europe, the lesson was clear. American artillery had evolved from an underestimated arm into a decisive force, one that shaped not only the battlefield, but the morale of those forced to endure it.